I'm Julie, and I'm just checking in. This is going to be a bit of a vlog portion of my food assignment for the Sustainability and Entrepreneurship class. So essentially one of the habits I wanted to talk about with food was essentially food waste and reducing food waste, but also kind of completing that food cycle. So I'm currently somebody who lives on my own, and I realized that you waste way more food as a solo person just because there's less people around to eat things. So I've been trying to find ways to reduce what I've been using. Bear with me, the kitten is just trying to get into the worm food. And so one of the things that kind of piqued my interest in the first course I took, Fundamentals of Sustainability, was everyone bringing up Vermi-Compost and how easy it is to do. And before I used to have compost outside, but now I live in a house in the city. So I just moved into winter, so I didn't really want to try to do some outdoor compost. So something indoors seems like a good idea for me. But so essentially this is my worm bin. It is a blue Rubbermaid tote. I've drilled holes around the top so that the worms can get oxygen. I have filled it with bedding, which I'll give you a little bit of a closer look at later. And so essentially I've had this bin for a month and a bit. Sorry, I'm just getting the cat out of here. I would hate for him to jump into the worm bin. So I've had this bin for about a month and a half. And I essentially just feed the worms once a week to check on them, to see how they're doing. The first few weeks I kind of panicked. I thought that there was a chance that maybe all my worms were dead. But they weren't. They were just hiding, and now they seem quite happy, and we've kind of come up with a pretty good system here. And so I do feed them once a week. This week, this is like their container of food. Essentially I have a container in the freezer, and so as I have scraps that are suitable for the worm bin, they go in there, and then I have some Ziploc bags, and as scraps that are suitable for soup stock, those ones go in there. So I kind of separate them depending on what the vegetable or waste is. So this week the worms are getting a variety of food. This is what their food looks like this week. But in here I have some strawberries that did not go well in my fridge, some leftover vegetables, some ends of asparagus and little bits of mushroom. I have some random plant leaves that fell off or got picked off some of my house plants, and then I have eggshells as well. I found that the eggshells are really good for the worm bin. It seems to kind of neutralize things a little bit and give them a little bit more grit. And depending on the week, I will also get coffee grounds from my coworker. So with the worm bin, I'm still not totally at the point where I will stick my bare hands in here. So I have one little rubber glove that I will reuse each week, just to kind of help me get in here and move some stuff around. So I'm going to change the camera angle so you can take a look to see kind of what a average week looks like in my worm bin. Keep in mind I'm only a month and a half in, so I'm still trying to figure out what they like, what they don't like, and kind of establish that kind of routine. But I will take a look and give you a tour of what the bin looks like on the inside. Alright, so here's the inside of the worm bin. I just want to make a few observations for you folks. So first thing is the smell. You can smell it obviously through camera, but one thing I was really relieved so far with the worm bin is I haven't really found there to be any odor. You can't even really tell that I'm composting in my basement, other than the fact that I pull out the worms once a week and feed them. So there is no smell that like smells gross. When you do open the bin, the smell that you kind of do get is more of like an earthy type odor of like soil and that kind of stuff, but it's not like when you walk into my basement, it smells really gross. The other component that I do find does smell a little bit, again, is the worm food. I think it could be mostly because I leave it in the freezer and then I let it thaw, so you kind of get that kind of like thawed, weird smell of all the components that are in it. So sometimes it might smell sweeter if I have fruit in there. This time it kind of smells primarily like portobello mushrooms because I have some chunks of mushroom in there. So yeah, I find though once it goes into the bin, it's pretty not noticeable. So the worms love to be covered. So currently they are covered, and what they're covered in is called their bedding. So I made mine out of a mix of cocoa coir, newspaper, and then I also threw in some other soil that was a little bit more grittier, and then other components in there. So their bedding is kind of where they live. And you can see there's things here. So like, for example, I have an avocado pit that I brought in, and they've essentially cleaned out the entire pit. Last week when I looked in here, there's lots of worms in here. This week, not so much for worms in there. This one too, they have cleaned out. There's some eggshells in there, but that's that. One thing I am learning is that the worms do not love potatoes. I have fed them potatoes and they really didn't love them. So I'm going to try to maybe take out any potato chunks that I see in here. Mostly because I don't want them to go super moldy or super bad, and you can kind of already see that they're starting to sprout a little bit if the camera's in focus. So I'm trying to avoid that from happening. So some of that waste I will be taking out just because it's a bit of a trial and error. Like again, I said this is a month and a half into my worm bin. And the one thing is I noticed they haven't touched the potatoes at all. So actually, I'm removing this top layer and I can see that they're still feasting on last week's food. I'm actually gonna see if I can pick some up for you. Come here, little guys. So here is what they look like. They are red wigglers. I actually was fortunate enough to get them from a coworker who does composting in her classroom. So these are the little red wiggler guys. They just wiggle around in here, and typically I find they generally will source to where their food is. So right now there's a whole swack of them in this middle part. Okay, so this is kind of cool, maybe gross if you don't like worms. I find them neat, I just don't like touching them with my hands yet. But here is an avocado pit similar to the other ones, except it is currently a home to a whole bunch of feasting worms. So I think that's pretty cool. I'm really sorry if you are grossed out by worms, but this is a Vermi-Compost video, so anyways. So those guys are in there. I can take a look in here and I can see that they haven't quite finished everything from last week. I'm gonna continue to take out some potatoes. I do have some mango in here that they're currently working on. Again, more potatoes that need to come out because some of them aren't really being eaten. I want to make sure I'm not throwing any worms out with them. So I'll scrape off any of the soil, or I guess the bedding that might be attached to it. But yeah, I noticed that they're really not eating these potatoes at all. They literally almost look like I just put them in there yesterday. So I'm just gonna take those out because they aren't loving them and I want happy worms. So one thing I am noticing though, it is quite moist and wet in here, and so I try to keep the bin so that it has like a good balance of like liquid to dryness. I don't want it to be like overloaded with moisture because I don't want to drown my worms. So one thing I have that I will show you, I'm just gonna take off my little glove here, is I have a whole bunch of pre-shredded newspaper. I got this set up when I was first setting up the bin. And so sometimes I will actually like sprinkle that in there amongst the bedding and things. So here's their food for the week. I'm just gonna add it to the center of the bin. When I first started feeding them, I was doing where I would feed them on one half and then the other half. But then I started reading about center feeding, so I've opted to try that way. I find this way I can kind of keep track of my worms a little bit better and I'm a little less stressed about them dying all the time. So I'm gonna add maybe a little bit more dry newspaper because it's pretty damp in there and I just wanna make sure that they don't drown. And then I will add their food for the week, and then the eggshell I kind of try to sprinkle in as well. So I am just gonna hopefully crumple up a little bit more newspaper. Again, I am not a worm expert, very much the opposite. I'm still learning about my worms and what they like, and that's kind of why I thought I would do this little video to kind of share my little journey with you. One thing that I think is kind of interesting is, okay, so I have a whole bunch of strawberries in here that just kind of sat in my fridge too long, didn't go well. So you can see I have, you know, the pink part still on. I find that I have picky worms and that they actually will eat the red part and then they will leave the green leaves in the bin. So I have a bunch of food in the middle for them. Container's empty. I'm gonna wash that out obviously because it does, you know, smell like their worm food, which is what whatever, and you can see it kind of in the center. So now I'm going to cover it back up. So the worms don't like light for the purpose of this video. Obviously I'm exposing the worms to you so I can show you, but typically they like to be nice and hidden and covered up. So now I'm just gonna cover them back up with their little bedding. So I just take a look around to make sure if I have any worms in here that aren't covered up. I like to cover them up just because I'm like, hey, I'm sorry I disrupted you. It was feeding time, but you know, it is what it is. Maybe I'll cover. I see a few. Where are they peeping out? So I'll cover them with those avocado peels. And then I'm just gonna look in some of the corners of the bin. I have some food in here that they weren't loving, so like the potatoes, I'm just gonna check to make sure there's no worms attached to them, and I'm just gonna chuck those out. I don't want certain things sitting in here for too long, because I really don't want like lots of like mold or anything in this bin. So again, yeah, the avocados, they seem to really like to hollow those guys out, which is good. Then I'm just checking to make sure there's no other big chunks in the corners or got pushed around that maybe I avoided. I'm a little concerned about how moist it is in the middle, so I might just add extra newspaper in here so it can absorb some of the humidity, because it is an enclosed steel container. So yeah, that's kind of like one of the biggest components of my worm routine, is just checking them once a week. Feeding them, making sure that they seem happy enough, well fed. I was reading that you should not let them go completely without food, because you know, you want to make sure they're constantly fed, so you don't want them to like starve for a bit and then be fed again. I always just make sure they have food. But I was told by someone who had a worm bin and forgot about it that they had left their bin for months, and when they like remembered about it, they thought all the worms were going to be dead, and it actually was so full of worms they had to just give them away to people because they spent the time reproducing, I guess. But yeah, so that is my worm bin. And then essentially I might add a few more little bits of newspaper just so that it can eventually get kind of mixed in the mix. And I don't think that this is totally necessary, but I just like to make sure I constantly have like a good balance from like wet to dry. And when I was feeding them today, I noticed that it was really, really, really wet in there, so hopefully the newspaper can help absorb some of that moisture as well. But I find that the newspaper also like eventually kind of composts itself into the bin, and you can kind of like, it's funny, I'll pick up gross newspaper but I won't pick up a worm, but you can see how it kind of gets like absorbed with the color, and it kind of gets covered in the bedding, and the worm casting kind of becomes part of that. So I imagine at some point it's going to become part of the bin. But yeah, so that is my worm bin. Alright, so that is my worm bin update. I have had this bin, like I said, for a month and a half. So far I haven't been fortunate for it to not smell. I have not spotted any other living organisms in there, but I have heard that is pretty normal. So if you find other I think they're saying like springtails or like centipedes or other bugs in there, it's because you've actually created an ecosystem inside your bin, so that is totally normal if it does happen. I was reading as well, some mold is normal, but you don't want your bin to be overrun with mold. So my intentions for the bin was kind of a two-part system. The main one being I wanted to make sure that the food I was wasting wasn't necessarily going to waste, wasn't just going to the garbage. Because I just find sometimes, you know, especially as someone who's living by themselves right now, you cook enough for one person, but it's really actually hard to eat all the food all the time, make it through the leftovers, and sometimes you find random things in the fridge or fruit, your vegetables you bought that you just didn't get to in time, especially because so much of the food you can buy are obviously in like, not bulk, but they are meant for larger servings. The second part that really motivated me to want to have a worm bin is I am a huge houseplant enthusiast. I've spent a lot of this pandemic really diving into that hobby because I found it was a hobby that was very COVID safe. It was easy to care for plants and watch them grow, and I didn't have to leave my house. And if I wanted to acquire new plants, I actually would either trade or buy with other local plant enthusiasts, and contactless pickup is always an option, which was really, really, really nice. So I really preferred that. So I kind of let that be my hobby. But one of the things I learned about houseplants is often that the potting soil you buy at the store is not the most beneficial soil you could use, and a lot of the times it ends up causing some issues with your houseplants. So I've gone all the way to the deep end, and I'm going to start making my own soil, which I found I really enjoy. And it's more sustainable because I'm no longer buying, bags of peat moss. Instead, I'm using coco coir, which is a sustainable substrate. Essentially, it is just ground up dehydrated coconut husks. And so I get bricks of those and I fill it with water, and then I mix other amendments in. But I was looking for a fertilizer to add to my houseplants, to their soil, that wasn't harsh or wasn't a chemical, and essentially the number one recommendation is worm castings. Worm castings across the board seems to be the preferred choice of amendment to add to your soil when you're making it yourself. And so I wanted to get the worm bin so I didn't have to go buy worm poop off other people off Facebook Marketplace. I spent $10 on worm poop once, and I realized, why am I spending money on that when I can put a bin in my basement, I can compost my own food, and then I can have beneficial things for my houseplants as well. So I'm excited to share this journey with you, and yeah, I will update you more throughout my food assignment. All right, take care.